The wind, a malevolent spirit of the high plains, clawed at Eleanor, stripping the thin warmth from her bones. It carried the scent of dust and distant, dying things, a fitting companion to her own despair. Each gust felt like a physical blow, a reminder of the recent, more brutal ones that still bruised her spirit deeper than her flesh. She hunched forward, her arms instinctively cradling the swell beneath her worn shawl, a silent plea for protection that the world had clearly chosen to ignore. Her breath plumed in the frigid air, a ghost of her own fading life. It had been weeks since she'd fled, weeks since the jeering faces, the hateful cries of "Whore! Fat sow!" echoed in the barn as the whip had bitten into her back, not for theft, not for any crime but for the unforgivable sin of being unwed, visibly pregnant, and, in their cruel estimation, obese. The shame had been a physical weight, heavier than the child growing within her, heavier than the relentless hunger that gnawed at her insides. They'd left her there, bloodied and broken, expecting her to die, or perhaps hoping she would. But she had a reason to live, a tiny, fluttering flicker of life that clung to her own with fierce determination. Her legs, unsteady with exhaustion and malnutrition, threatened to give way. The sun, a cold, indifferent eye, dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges that mocked her aching soul. Night was falling, and with it the predatory chill of the plains. She stumbled, her vision blurring, the sparse scrubland a shapeless blur of gray and brown. Every step was an act of raw will, a promise whispered to the life she carried. Not yet. We are not done yet. A shadow detached itself from the deepening twilight. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. It was a man, mounted on a dark horse, a silhouette against the fading light. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. Men had brought her only pain, only judgment. This one, tall and silent, with a wide-brimmed hat obscuring his face, seemed to embody the very emptiness of the landscape around them. He reined in his horse a short distance away, the animal's breath pluming like dragon smoke. He did not speak, did not move, simply watched her with an unnerving stillness. Eleanor considered running, but her body screamed in protest. There was nowhere to run, no strength left. She tightened her grip on her stomach, a desperate, futile gesture of defiance. Her ragged cloak offered little shield against the elements, let alone the potential threat of this stranger. The silence stretched, taut and suffocating, broken only by the mournful keen of the wind and the soft snorting of the horse. She could feel his gaze, an unreadable weight upon her, stripping away what little dignity she had left. Was this to be the end? Was this lonely, desolate place where she would finally collapse, where the last ember of her defiance would be snuffed out by the cold indifference of man and nature alike? She closed her eyes, preparing for whatever came next, a quiet prayer for her child forming on her lips. When she opened them, he was still there, a sentinel in the gathering darkness. The man dismounted, his movements economical, deliberate. He led his horse closer, the soft thud of its hooves on the dry earth echoing in the vast silence. Eleanor flinched, bracing for an expected blow or a harsh word, but neither came. He stopped a few yards from her, his face still obscured by shadow, his posture conveying a quiet, almost weary strength. He looked at her, not with the judging scorn she had grown accustomed to, but with an unnerving, unblinking assessment. It was the look of a man who saw not her condition, nor her supposed shame, but simply a creature on the brink. He unslung a canvas bag from his saddle, then knelt and began to gather dry brush. He worked with a practiced efficiency, his hands large and calloused. Within minutes, a small fire sparked to life, its flames reaching eagerly for the encroaching darkness. The warmth, though distant, was a profound comfort. Eleanor watched him, suspicion warring with a primal relief. He hadn't touched her, hadn't spoken, yet his actions were speaking volumes. He was a man of few words, it seemed, but of tangible deeds. From his bag, he produced a piece of dried meat and a hardtack biscuit. He held them out, not pushing, not demanding, simply offering. Eleanor hesitated, her stomach aching with hunger, but caution held her captive. Was this a trick? A prelude to some grim demand? Her experiences had taught her to trust no one. Yet, the smell of the meat, smoky and rich, was a siren call to her starving body. Slowly, she reached out, her fingers trembling as she took the offering. Their fingers brushed briefly, his skin rough, hers cold. He said nothing, merely withdrew his hand. She devoured the food, tearing at the meat with a ferocity born of desperation. It was the first substantial meal she'd had in days, perhaps weeks. The energy it provided was immediate, a small surge of strength returning to her weary limbs. As she ate, he sat opposite her, tending the fire, his gaze occasionally lifting to her, quick and assessing, but never lingering with anything approaching prurience or judgment. He was simply there, a silent presence against the vast, indifferent landscape. "Silas," he finally said. His voice a low rumble, blending with the crackle of the fire. It was the first word he'd uttered. He offered nothing more, no explanation, no question. Eleanor found her own voice, raspy from disuse. Eleanor, her name felt fragile, exposed. He nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his head. The conversation ended there. He wrapped himself in a blanket, his back to the fire, and lay down. Eleanor, still wary, stayed awake, watching the dancing flames, listening to the wind and the occasional snort from the horse. But something in his stillness, his quiet, competent presence, began to chip away at her defenses. He was an enigma, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of something other than abject fear. She was still vulnerable, still alone in a harsh world, but for tonight, she was not utterly adrift. They traveled north for days, Silas always leading, Eleanor following, a silent procession across the endless, rolling plains. He never asked about her past, never inquired about the father of her child, or the reason for her desolate flight. His silence was not dismissive, but rather a vast, accepting space where her pain could simply exist without judgment. He provided for them with a quiet competence that inspired a fragile trust. He hunted small game, cleaned it expertly, and shared it with her, always ensuring she had enough. He found sheltered ravines and rocky overhangs for them to camp, shielding her from the biting wind. Eleanor watched him, her eyes absorbing every detail of his movements. He was a man of the land, perfectly attuned to its rhythms, its dangers. His face, when she could catch a glimpse of it in the firelight, was rugged, etched with lines that spoke of hardship and solitude, but also of an enduring strength. His eyes, deep-set and dark, held an almost melancholic wisdom. She learned to read his subtle cues. The way he scanned the horizon, the almost imperceptible tensing of his shoulders when a distant dust cloud appeared, his quiet hum when content. She found herself mirroring his watchfulness, her senses sharpening, her fear slowly beginning to recede, replaced by a cautious awareness. The child within her grew, a tangible presence, a constant reminder of the life she fought to protect. Her body, once seen as a mark of shame, now felt like a vessel of profound purpose. Silas never commented on her increasing size, never betrayed the slightest discomfort or curiosity. He simply adjusted, making sure her saddle was comfortable, offering his arm when they crossed uneven terrain, always with the same stoic, unreadable expression. His presence was a bulwark against the world's cruelty, a silent promise of protection she hadn't known she desperately craved. One evening, as they rested by a small, trickling creek, Eleanor felt a dull ache in her lower back, a tightening sensation she hadn't experienced before. She tried to ignore it, to dismiss it as fatigue, but a cold tendril of fear snaked through her. She looked at Silas, unsure of what to say, how to articulate her growing apprehension. He was cleaning his rifle, his brow furrowed in concentration. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. For a moment, she saw a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Concern, perhaps, or a deep understanding. Before she could speak, a distant rumble disturbed the quiet evening. Hoofbeats. Many of them. Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat. Her past, it seemed, had caught up to her. Silas's gaze sharpened, his body instantly alert. He stood, his rifle held loosely but purposefully. The sound grew louder, closer, accompanied by harsh shouts. Eleanor recognized a voice from her nightmares, a man named Jedediah, one of the cruelest among those who had whipped her. Her blood ran cold. She scrambled to her feet, her hands instinctively going to her swollen belly. There were too many of them, at least 4 or 5, their forms appearing on the crest of the hill, backlit by the setting sun, transformed into menacing giants. Her legs felt like lead. She had nowhere to run, no way to protect herself or her child. This was it. There she is. Jedediah's voice boomed, thick with malice and triumph. The fat sow. Thought she could run, did she? He spurred his horse forward, his companions following, a grim tableau of vengeance. Eleanor braced herself, a scream caught in her throat. She looked at Silas, despair filling her eyes. He stood between her and the approaching riders, a lone figure against the encroaching darkness. His posture was still, unervingly calm, but something in the set of his jaw, the hard glint in his eyes, had shifted. He was no longer just a silent protector. He was a force about to be unleashed. Jedediah and his men pulled up short, their horses rearing slightly, their faces contorted with leering satisfaction. They saw Eleanor, clearly visible now, her pregnancy undeniable. Their cruel laughter filled the air. Look at her, boys. Bigger than ever. Guess we'll have to beat it out of her this time. Jedediah dismounted, a thick riding crop in his hand, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. Eleanor shrank back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a sob. Every fiber of her being screamed to flee, but her body refused to obey. She was trapped, the past a suffocating shroud. She watched Jedediah advance, his heavy boots crunching on the dry ground, his cruel smile fixed. Her gaze flickered to Silas, who remained utterly still, his rifle hanging at his side, a silent, menacing sentinel. You best move along, stranger, Jedediah sneered, his eyes barely glancing at Silas, dismissing him as an irrelevant obstacle. This ain't your business. This is our property. A runaway whore who needs to be taught a lesson. Silas didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. His eyes, dark as midnight, fixed on Jedediah with an intensity that seemed to drain the air from the space between them. She is not your property, he said, his voice low, a quiet tremor that was more of a warning than a statement. And she is no whore. Jedediah laughed, a harsh, grating sound. And who are you to say, you ragged stranger? She's pregnant and worthless. Got no place in decent society. We'll take her back to where she belongs. Teach her a lesson she won't forget. He took another step, raising the whip slightly. It was then that Silas moved. Not quickly, not with a sudden rush, but with an unnerving, almost deliberate slowness that held more menace than any speed. He stepped fully into the light of the dying day, his hand moving to the rifle, not raising it, but simply resting it there, his thumb brushing the trigger guard. His gaze never left Jedediah's face. The air crackled with unspoken tension. The other men, still on their horses, shifted uneasily. Something in Silas's stillness, his quiet, contained power, had them hesitating. Listen closely, Silas said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence like a sharpened blade. If they touch you again, he glanced briefly at Eleanor, his eyes conveying a raw, protective ferocity she had never witnessed. They perish. The words hung in the air, cold and absolute. There was no room for misinterpretation, no hint of a threat, but a statement of inevitable consequence. Jedediah's cruel smile faltered. He looked from Silas's unyielding eyes to the rifle, then back to the man's face, searching for a bluff, finding none. He saw only cold, unwavering resolve. The casual contempt on the faces of his men had vanished. replaced by a dawning comprehension, a flicker of fear. This man was not to be trifled with. He was not just protecting her, he was declaring her sacred. The implication of his words, delivered with such quiet certainty, was more terrifying than any shouted threat. They understood. The confrontation lingered, suspended in the dusk, the unspoken violence between them a tangible thing. Jedediah, for all his bluster, was no fool. He saw the cold fire in Silas's eyes, understood the unspoken promise of death that lay behind those few, chilling words. He saw not a man with a weapon, but a man who was a weapon, aimed with deadly precision. He looked at Eleanor, no longer seeing a helpless victim, but a person guarded by an unyielding force. His face, which had been contorted with malice, now contorted with frustrated fury. He knew defeat when he stared it in the face. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Jedediah lowered the riding crop. He backed away, his eyes never leaving Silas. "This ain't over," he snarled, a pathetic attempt to reclaim some dignity. But the fight had gone out of him. He swung himself back onto his horse, his movements less confident than before. His men, sensing their leader's capitulation, turned their horses. Without another word, they rode away, their hasty retreat kicking up a cloud of dust that swallowed them whole. The only sound left was the pounding of Eleanor's own heart. Eleanor stood trembling, a wave of relief so profound it threatened to buckle her knees washing over her. She watched the dust cloud fade into the darkening horizon, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Silas had not moved. He stood there, his rifle still casually held, his gaze following the retreating figures until they were completely out of sight. When he finally turned back to her, the dangerous glint in his eyes had softened, though the quiet resolve remained. He approached her, and for the first time, Eleanor didn't flinch. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not just a protector, but a man who had offered her something she hadn't dared to dream of: unwavering sanctuary. The words he'd spoken, sharp and final, resonated within her. "If they touch you again, they perish." It was a vow, a declaration that she was no longer alone, no longer a plaything for the cruel and the judgmental. She found herself weeping quiet, cleansing tears that streamed down her face. Not tears of fear, but of release, of gratitude, of a deep, inarticulate understanding. Silas simply watched her, his presence a steady anchor. He didn't offer a hand, didn't try to comfort her with empty words. He simply allowed her to feel, to purge the last remnants of terror and shame. When her tears subsided, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and met his gaze. There were no words to express the depth of her gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice still hoarse. He nodded, a simple acknowledgement that encompassed all she felt. The air, once thick with tension, now carried a new quality, a quiet peace, a fragile hope. The encounter had cemented something between them, an unbreakable bond forged in the crucible of shared danger. She had faced her past, and it had been driven away, not by her own strength alone, but by the quiet power of a man who saw her worth, who saw beyond the labels, beyond the judgments, to the vulnerable life she carried. They resumed their journey, but it was different now. Eleanor walked with a new sense of purpose, her head held a little higher. The fear had not vanished entirely, but it no longer dictated her every move. She was still a woman alone in a vast, indifferent land, but she was no longer defenseless. She had found not just a companion, but a quiet, formidable ally, a guardian against a world that had sought to break her. The child within her stirred, a gentle flutter, and Eleanor placed a hand on her belly, a soft, resolute smile gracing her lips. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, she faced it with dignity, with resilience, and with the quiet knowledge that she was finally, truly, safe. The sun was setting, casting long shadows, but in the heart of the wilderness, a new dawn had begun.